hopefully we can still have an open, candid discussion here as the slides that'll guide our meeting today is, at least this first time, to read aloud a statement that the Tennessee Department of Education wants on record. Can everybody hear me? It looked like there was a drag. Is everybody good? Okay. So I'm going to do that. This will hopefully be the last thing that I read to you, because I know you're all very capable of reading yourselves. But Penny, I'm going to go ahead and start reading it while you're getting the screen set up to share. Does that sound good? Okay. So the Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. All right. Any questions about any of that? I think the commissioners made it fairly clear that we are not discussing the BEP, and we would like to hold it to that line, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means here shortly. Now we've had, looks like we've had Charlie Baum join us. Is that correct? Welcome.
Yes. Good morning. How are you all?
Good morning.
Good afternoon.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to take a look at our agenda. We have a welcome and call to order. We have done the statement. The next thing we're going to do is the roll call, attendance, and introductions. I do know that, I'll make sure I get the, Robert Ebby is a state school board member, and he did send his regrets. He can't make it because there's actually a state school board meeting today. So he looks forward to working with us, but cannot join us today. But at this point, Penny, are you able to call roll for us? If not, I can.
Yes, I will let you, if you don't mind, I will let you, I'm still admitting folks. So if you do that, I would appreciate it.
Okay. I guess it's pretty obvious on the video, but we'll do it anyway, since it's on the agenda. Angela Huff.
They are not letting me in. Oh, there they go. They're letting me in. I'm good. I'm in.
Good to have you, Senator Rose.
Well, I was just calling my office to let you guys know that I was trying to reach you from Rose Construction. So you got me in. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot of places in my neighborhood that won't let me in either, so I know the feeling, but glad they changed their mind.
Yeah, I was just in a reception for Sheriff Poncho, and there were no less than 150 law enforcement personnel there, so I thought maybe they had called you to tell you don't let me in.
All right, well, we're going to come back and kind of do some brief introductions, but I'll just, for the record, I'll just go ahead and call the names out. Angela Huff.
Here.
Katrine Stevens.
Here.
Dell Phillips. See Dell. Charlie Baum.
Here.
Scott Becker. Annette Tudor.
Here.
Vanessa Presson. Bill Spurlock.
Here.
Hey, Bill. Jason Golden. I know Jason had said he had a conflict as well. He was going to try to do a little of both and may even be listening, but he had a conflict in advance. John Atkin.
Here.
Paul Rose.
Here.
Again, Robert Ebby sent his regrets for today's meeting. All right, so what we'd like to do now is everybody would introduce themselves, say which organization or community you represent, something you're looking forward to, and what you hope you can contribute. And I'll begin. I'm Ted Horrell. I'm the superintendent of Lakeland School System. I was honored to be asked to be on this committee and then to chair it. I'm looking forward to getting some different perspectives, not only from the folks that work in schools, but also those outside of schools, because we probably don't hear as much in terms of intense conversations about funding with those groups, and hope to contribute to the process. Really just the opportunity that we have to do something that we can be a part of. It's easy to criticize and complain about the funding formula, but hopefully if this is what it appears to be, then this is an opportunity to help create that. So I'm excited about that. And I'm going to go down the list that I have and let Angela Huff, you can go next.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am the interim superintendent or interim director of schools for the Clarksville Montgomery County School System. Very excited to be a part of this committee to really talk about what things make CMCSS really unique as a part of this process, but also to learn from you all and to hopefully that we can come to something at the end of this that will be beneficial for everyone. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. All right, Katrine.
All right, so I am Katrine Stevens, and side note, when you see my name, it looks like Catherine. I have an American father and French mother, and together my name is Katrine. I am the superintendent in Tullahoma at Tullahoma City Schools, a rural district within Coffee County in the middle region. What I look forward to is collaborating, the exchange of ideas, listening to varied perspectives, pondering interesting questions, and really coming together on some thoughts that we can contribute to the greater good for students. And that's certainly the hope, is some outcome from this group that lends to great things for our students in our school districts.
Great, thank you. All right, I think we said Dell Phillips is not here, I believe. Charlie Baum.
Yes, my name's Charlie Baum. I teach economics at Middle Tennessee State University, and I serve in the Tennessee State House. I represent District 37, which is about a fourth of Rutherford County. So looking forward to the discussion, see if we can find ways to improve education and funding.
Did I freeze up there? Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I hope this isn't a trend. Annette, can you hear me?
Yes, I got you now. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Annette Tudor. I am Director of Schools for Bristol City Schools in East Tennessee, Sullivan County. We actually border Bristol, Virginia, so that's where we're located. I'm actually looking forward to digging in and learning more about a student-centered funding model. So I think that is what intrigues me most about this process, and hope that maybe I can contribute the perspective of a small municipal district. We are a small city district inside of a larger county. We also have 2 city districts in our county. So just the East Tennessee perspective from a small city municipal district. So it's good. I'm looking forward to working with you all.
Great. Thank you, Annette. All right, Bill.
Yeah, I'm Bill Spurlock, Director of Rutherford County Schools, and I'm in, one of the things that I'm looking forward to is working with this committee, including Representative Baum. I've always had a great relationship with him. I know he's a very bright man. And what I hope to contribute is the challenges of a suburban growing district, and looking at how we can make equity across the state of Tennessee as far as school funding.
Great. Thank you, Bill. All right, John Atkin.
Hey, thank you. John Atkin, retired superintendent of both Collierville Schools and Shelby County Schools. Currently executive director of AIMS, which is the organization that represents the municipal and special school districts in Tennessee. Not sure what I'm going to contribute. I bring a little different perspective, and the fact that I served on the BEP review committee back in a previous time, and also served in a large I guess, Suburban district, and now recently retired as superintendent of Collierville, obviously a municipal district, and look forward to hearing some ideas of what can make the BEP, or where, excuse me, I'm not supposed to say that. I've broken one rule right now. The new student-centered formula, kind of echoing what Bill said, equitable formula for everybody across the state.
Great. Thank you, John. All right, Paul Rose.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. Harrell, and it's thank you for being willing to chair. I look forward to working with you. I am Senator District 32, which is Tipton County and the eastern edge of Shelby. That's what it looks like today anyway. It's going to change here before too long. I am a product of public schools. I own my company called Rose Construction. And what I first of all, I look forward to working with each of you, and certainly I know Representative Vaughn and Dr. Harrell. But I've heard for years that what we're doing is not right. It's broken. We're not equitably funding students across Tennessee. And one of the things I learned in school was you can't fix anything and you can't solve a problem until you know what the problem is. And then the other adage, if it ain't broke, leave it alone. So if it's broken, I look forward to finding out what is broken about it. And then once we determine that, then we can figure out, hopefully, what we can do to help fix what's broken. So look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Anything else anybody would like to add before we move on from the introductions? Everybody good? Okay. The next part of the agenda here is the lens of this committee and some discussion on that, and just making sure we're on the same page as to what we are doing and are not doing. So what we're doing in this particular committee is supposed to address the specific kind of perspective of suburban and fast-growing communities, and the student groups that are in those communities, which may be a little different from urban communities or from rural communities or from any other types of school groups. So we want to look specifically at that, but we also certainly are allowed and encouraged to discuss perspectives of students in throughout the state of Tennessee. And Representative Baum and I'm sure Senator Rose, you hear a lot about those as well, probably more than we do. So that'll be helpful perspective. We also, it says and/or, want to talk about what kind of supports that we believe students need to be successful, such as post-secondary readiness, but could be anything. And again, what does every learner in the state of Tennessee need, along with our specific student groups, based on our own history and experience back there in education and or whatever our backgrounds that we're bringing to the table are. One of the ways that that we want to do this is to have some background on what it's calling the introduction slides. These were sent separately, and one of the things that apparently was kind of learned from some of the other committees that met earlier in the week was understandably that folks really had not had much of a chance to go through these slides and kind of get the basics of what it is we're talking about. So really at the request of the commissioner and Penny, who got some feedback from some of the other ones, we're actually going to go through some of these school funding overviews. Again, I'm not going to read to everybody, but I do want to make sure that we know roughly what it is that's being discussed, kind of what is being proposed, because I think it's important to know this entire process is working towards a particular outcome. So while we're saying that we want to do something that's new and that's different, we're not exactly just throwing it out to the wind and saying it can be anything we want it to be, because there really are some guardrails that I believe, I certainly won't speak for him, but I believe that the governor is interested in, and that the Department of Education is kind of working within the framework. So we want to make sure we at least have a concept of what these other models look like that are not the BEP. I think I'm allowed to say that. So I think I'm not going to read you what public school funding is. I think we all know that that's the money we get from federal, state, and local dollars Do we need to talk about why it's important? I think we understand why public school funding is important. Is that fair? Anybody feel free to cut in. I don't want to get ahead of it. What are the goals of a good formula kind of for the purposes of this committee? We want to make sure people understand it. We want to make sure that all students benefit, that we can do it over time, that it's sustainable, and that I think fiscally responsible, certainly that our legislators can defend it, that it makes sense from a state budget perspective, that it's outcomes focused, and that it is somewhat flexible. So there are several things in here that some formulas probably wouldn't go into that category in terms of ease to understand, and is it flexible, and even is it sustainable. So these next three is where we really start to get into the types of state funding that exist currently. And there are three prominent types, and we've got some experience with each of these. Student-based is the one that this process is designed to drive us toward. This is what we're being told that, again, we're being told that the governor and the Department of Education would like us to consider. A student-based model is where the vast majority of states have either already gone or are headed. And that I'll be honest, that was kind of lost on me when the conversation started. I'm surprised by the number of states that already have student-based models. And so what we're talking about, and we'll delve into this one more, this is a base amount of funding, and we'll talk a lot about that, what's in the base, where you add money on top of it based on the different categories that students are in, basically. So with students with higher need or unique context, typically using weights or multipliers, and I think the state has already kind of favored the term weights. We're talking a lot about weights. How do we weight these different categories of students, frankly, or flat rates for more standardized costs that don't necessarily depend on the type of student, but may depend on the type of program that's being offered, or maybe even the environment that the student was in. So we're going to talk more about student-based, so I won't ask if there are any questions there at the risk of just droning on, but we'll come back to that one. Resource-based is what the BEP is. The BEP is a resource-based funding formula. So districts receive a minimum base amount for resources, such as money for staffing, services, and programs. Resource-based models often use a ratio based on staffing to students. And at this point, instead of me just talking, who can throw in a couple of more? We are allowed to talk about it as a model, resource-based funding. It just happens to be the one that the BEP is. What are some examples of what that looks like in Tennessee, committee members?
Don't everyone jump on it at once. Ted, are we talking about the allocation for staffing in terms of nurses and social workers and things of that nature?
Yes. So in the resource-based model, if you look at the BEP, the way it's broken down, it will say that, for example, this is a common one, that each school system will get one nurse for every 3,000 students. And then there will be a salary assigned to what, according to the BEP, it would take to fund a nurse. And then you get the ratio. If we've only, my district doesn't have 3,000 students, it's got 1,900 students. So we would get a percentage of a nurse's salary assigned to us, unless there's a rule that says every district gets one, or every school gets one. And there are some like that. So basically, the way the resource-based one, it tends to break it down by ratios of numbers. For every 30 high school students, you get a high school teacher. For every maybe 20 kindergarten students, you get a kindergarten teacher, whatever those numbers are. And then there's a salary base assigned to each of those categories that determines how the district gets it. And then it's important to note, in a resource-based one, and you all know this and have heard this, it's a funding formula, not a spending formula. So we get that pot of money and then we spend it on whatever we think makes the most sense for for our district. So great question. Was that helpful, Representative Baum? Okay, good. And anybody else can answer or pitch in if you'd like to. Are we
Ted,
good?
I can't answer, but I would like to at least put a question out there, and if you may just want to park it and pick it up in one of our other 7 meetings I think we're supposed to have. But when the state allocates money to a district, and you stated you get to decide how you're going to spend it, and we're trying as the legislature trying to drive those monies toward the teachers. Again, that may not be what we need to be talking about. So park it if you need to and say, Senator, I'll get with you later. But does that play into this concept of resource-based funding?
My understanding that it in terms of the difference between resource and student-based funding, it would still not compel a district to spend money in certain ways. And unless there's, you can have minimum like we do, we can have minimums that we're allowed to pay teachers, but that my understanding is that in most student-based models, at the end of the day, it's still a funding formula, not a spending formula. So the districts would still get an amount. Now, what it would do, and I think this is one of the goals, perhaps. Well, I shouldn't say it's a goal, but I think it's one of the outcomes. What it does allow the public to do is get a better idea of how much each school was funded, which is really hard to determine now. So what it would say is that if every student has and we're going to use the term value, it doesn't mean that some students are more valuable than others, but from a financial perspective, if you know what each student's value is in terms of funding, then you can say this school was funded at this amount, and then it does kind of put some pressure on schools, I guess, to answer that question. Well, how come if they generated this much money, how come that money is being spent at these other schools, for example, or is being spent on other things other than that? So it allows the student-based model, makes it easier to keep up with how individual schools and even classrooms are funded.
Ted, would it be okay for me to ask a question at this time?
Please.
On the student-based, it follows the student. Now, in a a growing system like some of ours, including Rutherford County, would the funding be provided in the beginning instead of the growth occurring in February and at the end of the fiscal year?
That's a great question, and that was and so I did, in terms of insight, that they are having separate meetings for just the chairs. The one today was from 11 to noon. I actually had to jump off it to do this meeting, and that was one of the questions that came up. That there are different states that do that differently, and some of them will take basically run the 20-day report, like we call it, the attendance report, once a month. You can run it as many times as you want to, instead of just having those kind of high stakes one. And I do think that with the technology that we have, it seems like it should be easier to run and update that on a more regular basis. So that is absolutely a question. It's not really one that we've been charged with directly, but it is a question about what does a funding model look like that's unanswered. We don't have an answer to what that would be. And for those that don't know, schools are funded currently based on the previous year's enrollment. And we basically, if we have a lot of growth, like most of the districts that are represented here have had, you may kind of have to depend on your fund balance to get you through. And then at the end of the year, there's growth funds that if it's a certain amount, will kind of get paid up at the end of the year to kind of make you whole. But it is there's some financial kind of planning that has to go on there to be sure that if you've got 150 or 200 more kids, which is quite a bit, then or certainly anything more than that, you've got to have the funds in the kitty to pay to take care of those kids in the meantime. Any more questions or comments on resource-based versus student-based? Again, we're going to talk a lot more about student-based because that's really the focus. All right. And then categorical, we're going to talk the least about probably. That's when districts get money and it's basically, this is a specific program, and usually there may be shorter term kind of things that says we've got a lot of these right now in terms of the federal grants that are coming out through the state. This is how federal funds are typically allocated. So the federal government will say, all right, here's your category. The category is Title I, or the category is Title II, or the category is a COVID testing program, and you're going to get those funds, and here's the amount you're getting, and here's the timeline to spend those funds, and you need to defend what it is. So that's really, those are usually the on top ofs that we get, and are not, we don't, I think as school leaders, we don't think of those in the same way, although they're certainly part of how we plan. Any questions about categorical funds in general? That's really not changing. It looks like that's up to the federal government. We don't have any say on how that works. And they're really the only apparently organization that uses a categorical funding model. All right, if we can go to the next slide, there it is, moving to a student-based formula. This is what was surprising to me. And it says very clearly Tennessee's considering a student-based formula. 39 states have already gone that direction, which you can see from the map is, again, like I said, the vast majority of states, including many in our geographic area and many similar states in terms of composition to us. So this is not something that's a new concept or that Tennessee is really pioneering necessarily, which is a good thing and makes it a little bit easier for us most likely. And there are lots of models out there in terms of how to do it. So that's an important thing there. One of the things that we were told in our superintendent's meeting, but I'll share this with everybody, that also resonated with me, is that there are new or newer federal guidelines that require school-based funding to be reported. And that is very difficult to do, I'm told and understand, in a resource-based funding formula where the money just comes into the central office, because legislators, one of the things that makes it difficult is again, through the resource-based model, let's just say you've got 150 kids in a category, and under the formula, it says you get one teacher for every 50 kids. So you've got, 3 teachers in this particular category. Well, you may have 4 schools. So the kids aren't split up into neat little packs of 50 that teacher follows them around in this example. So it makes it difficult to figure out how much of your money is going to which school under that funding model. Whereas the student-based funding model would say, for example, every single student generates, let's say, $5,500, and they take that to their school plus these other multipliers that we'll talk about in just a second. Does that make any sense? Yep. Okay, so I think that's one of the reasons that so many states have gone through this, because it makes reporting easier. It adds to the transparency that has been discussed previously. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what does this look like, the student-based formula. And again, forgive me if I'm doing a lot of talking, but it was the thought was that in some of the other committee meetings, they didn't have some of this background, so it made the following conversation less productive maybe. All right, so the base is where we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. And the base is really what I just said. This is a certain amount of money that every single student in the state of Tennessee gets, no matter what. Every kid generates this amount of money. So it should include all the things that every student needs. And therein probably lies the rub, in that we have to have conversations about what is it that every student needs, and what does every school need. And there's some things we know that we need teachers, but what is that ratio? And what is an appropriate base salary for teachers? And is it, I think most folks generally agree with the concept that every school needs a nurse. It does get a little complicated when some schools have, 300 students and some schools have 1,200 students. So you have to get kind of more back into some ratios there. But does every school need a school resource officer, for example? I know those are conversations that legislators have had. So the question, counselors and, we hear a lot about counselors and social workers and nurses and things and RTI coordinators. So what goes into that base that every single student would generate in the state of Tennessee? So if you took the number of students you had at your school and you'd multiply it by that base number, that's what you'd start with. The next step and the next level of complexity are the weights. So this is the weights or the multipliers. So let's say that you've got a child and they're not economically disadvantaged. They're not special needs. English is their first language. I don't want to say just a plain old regular student. That student might only get that base. In other words, the school or school system would only be funded on that base. But let's say that student's brother, let's not say his brother, let's say their neighbor is special needs and is economically disadvantaged and speaks English as a second language. So under this kind of model, you may take that base and you may add 5% of the base because that student has special needs and will need special education services. You may add another, let's say 3%, because that student has English as a second language and is going to need some support there. So some additional funds to pay those teachers. And you may want to add another 6% because that person's economically disadvantaged. And we know that kids from economically disadvantaged backgrounds may need more tutoring, or they may need more teacher's assistance, or they may need more support. So what that means is, again, every student's got the base, but for every one of these multipliers or weights, they get an additional amount on top of that. So the challenging question really becomes, what are those categories? And then how much should they be weighted? How much more does it cost to educate a student with special needs? How much more does it cost to educate, English as a second language or an economically disadvantaged student? Any questions or thoughts about that concept?
Ted, you'll get, I'll ask a lot of questions. I was with you other than RTI coordinator. That I don't know what that is. Tell me.
Okay, great. Thank you. Does somebody want to, I'm just tired of hearing myself talk. Does somebody else, school leader, want to share about RTI? All right, RTI stands for Response to Intervention, and that is a state mandated program in which students must be regularly benchmark tested. And what we're testing for is to see gaps in their learning. So we're trying to find out which students need remediation. And again, this was a state a program created by the legislature, and we are currently not really funded to do that work, but we've got to test all the students. Students then go into tiers. If they're in tier 1, that's all students. If they're in tier 2, that means that they need a certain level of support. If they're in tier 3, that means they need a fairly intensive level of support. And that support comes through, again, state mandated remediation, basically during the school day. So we have to set up schedules where those students can be pulled out and given additional instruction or support without missing regular instructional time. So it's a lot of data management. So most schools have somebody that's just dedicated to that. But then you have to, at least in our school system, we have to hire additional assistants to kind of be the boots on the ground and sit and work with those students, whether it's doing flashcards or worksheets or or computer-based assessment. So it's a very significant part of basically all
Thank
of
you
it.
for that explanation.
Sure thing. Did I leave anything out? School leaders? Or Penny? Okay. All right, rock and roll. Great question. All right, so those are the weights. The categories I used were just kind of the ones that seemed to come up the most commonly. The direct funding was explained to us as being, these are specific programs that don't have quite as much to do with the specifics of the student. But for example, every junior takes the ACT, and that's funded by the state of Tennessee. That would be a direct funding program. There would have to be, a decision made about how much it costs to do that, and you multiply it by the number of juniors that you have that year, and that's direct. So it's not part of the base because it's not every single student. It's not really a weight or a ratio because it doesn't vary so much by student. That's a direct funding program that everybody in a particular category gets, is the way that one was described. And then outcomes, I probably have less of a sense of this one, but I think these are if we are focusing specifically on things like, and it says traditionally higher needs student groups, if we are trying to close the gap between economically disadvantaged students and non-economically disadvantaged, or schools with high concentrations of poverty, closing the gaps between those students and students that aren't economically disadvantaged, there could be some additional funds dedicated to that, because those are part of our federal and state accountability goals as well. So that would even be on top of the weights. So you've got the base, every single student in Tennessee, no matter what, gets a certain amount of money. The weights, we've got these different categories that you get maybe a percentage or a multiplier there. You got some more money that's for these specific programs. And then you've got outcomes-based funding that might be on top of all of that. So that is essentially what a student-based formula is. And it is a different construct than what we currently use. Mr. Atkin.
Hey, Ted, thank you. The previous slide, we don't have to go back. A hybrid student-based formula was mentioned, and I tried to find, have you been provided with any states that use a hybrid student-based that I could go look at their formula and see what it really means?
I have not. Penny, are you aware of any specific examples?
Commissioner told us earlier today that a list of those states are coming. They're working on compiling that right now.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, any other questions before we move on? All right.
I'll ask.
Yeah, go ahead.
When we get into the weights, some students will fit multiple categories. Some may be have some kind of disability, and they may also not have English as their first language. Will we plan to adjust the weights when students fit two categories, or will the weights be additive so that you get a weight that's the sum of all the weights for all the categories that you fit?
My understanding, that's a great question. My understanding is it would be the sum of all the weights that you fit. So if I'm economically disadvantaged and English as a second language, then I'd get my base. I'd get, for let's say, my 5% of the base for being ED, and then the 3% of the base on top of that for being English language learner.
That's something we may want to think about, because some of these students may need some kind of instruction in some area, but once they receive the instruction in a particular area, because English isn't their first language, then they've got the instruction, and they don't necessarily need that particular instruction again because they're low income.
I think that's a good point. I think it's definitely something to consider when we consider what the weights might be, and is there a way to move in and out of those worlds. I do think one of the intentions was that this kind of model is more flexible, and I think that speaks to what you're describing, assuming that the data can be kept up with, which we know it can. That's a good point, Representative.
Ted, we'd even have some differentiation with our SPED according to the options, what options they are. So that would be a little bit different also.
That is correct. We have, and I think what Bill's referring to is we have SPED students that are in the SPED category where they can't feed themselves and have to have their diapers changed. And then we have some that are, may have very mild learning disabilities, but do need staff support. So there's definitely a wide range of students in SPED categories, and even in English as a second English learner categories is what we call it now, EL. There are some that can't speak a word of English when they come in, and they're on one tier, and then there are some that just need that help and remediation. So all good thoughts and good points. Anything else before we dig in a little bit more?
Ted, I may have missed this, but did you talk about when the funds would come, if it would be the beginning of the year or not until middle of the year? Did I miss that? I may have missed that.
No, I don't believe you did miss it. The question was asked about the timing, and I think the thought is that, or the goal would be that these are funds you get at the beginning of the year for the students that you have that year, so that you have registered the students. Everybody's in EIS, which is the data tracking system for our state, and that gets sent to finance, and they hit you back with that amount. Right. And then it might be able to be adjusted over the course of the year, because we all know that students leave. You start school, and some students withdraw, or maybe they transfer to another school, or maybe they move, or so it obviously puts us in a position, if you have a student that generates a lot of funds, maybe they are one of those very high need special education students, and then they leave your school. If they're kind of taking that money with them, you have to be able to make those adjustments for sure.
Thank you.
Yep.
Ted, you're thinking about that. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is mobility. Certain schools within our system, there's more mobility with those students than, other schools. So that's something else that we'll need to track.
Totally agree. That's gonna be a major question. Yep. All right, let's move on. They've got some examples. Most of this I think we've talked through. So if you feel like we need to talk some more, let me know. But again, the base is every student's got it. They've got some examples of what that looks like. Every student, needs these things: educators, support staff, district supports, talks to response to instruction and intervention, transportation, facilities, and maintenance. Again, those are the things that would go in the base. We'll move on to the weights. The weight examples, the commissioner made the point in the call I just got off that she doesn't anticipate having 10 categories of weights like we have here, but those are all examples to think about. A grade level is one I haven't mentioned, though, that certainly is one. It costs more money to educate elementary school students than it does high school students, for the most part, just due to the smaller class size requirements. And then the direct funding examples, we mentioned ACT, dual credit courses for high school students. That's one that applies to everybody. Summer programming and CTE. And then the outcomes examples, bonus dollars, if you kind of incentivizing stronger outcomes for higher needs students. There's some discussion about, the desirability of basically funding based on test scores. There doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite for that, frankly, and I think it's not as widely used, but it is an option where test scores are incentivized and additional funding is generated based on that. That's one example of outcomes based.
Hey, Ted, I'm not seeing your PowerPoint. No offense to everybody I'm looking at, but is that just me? Have I done something on my end?
Penny
Nope.
is steering. Or have you got that still available, Penny?
Other than Charlie, it's a good group to look at, but
Yes. No, is it not showing up?
no.
No, it went to us. It looked like maybe your desktop, and then it went away.
All right, let me see. Tell me
There
if you
you
can
go.
see.
There you go.
There it is.
Thank you.
Okay.
There it is. Thank you for flagging that. I'm looking at it on a PDF at the same time. So we were on the student-based formula outcomes examples, and we've kind of already talked through most of this. Any questions?
Hey, Ted, just park it if you need to, but just on the reward or the outcome, to me, I just want to make sure again, if we're not supposed to discuss it, that's fine, but when you're rewarding or you're funding based on test scores, that's something I hear that is problematic. Whether it is or not, I don't know, but that's certainly what we hear from my teachers here in both Shelby and Tipton. So again, we can park that, talk about it later, but I know I'd like to see us focus on exactly what that means if it becomes part of our recommendation.
Yeah, I think, and it may be a good opportunity just to do a gut check here. I wouldn't, personally think, I agree with you. I think it would be problematic to start incentivizing outcome-based funding for a number of reasons. I'm seeing some other superintendents nod their heads. Is there anybody that would be a strong supporter of outcome-based funding?
Ted, I kind of looked at it in the perspective of not so much, improving for the whole, but those at-risk kids, closing those gaps. I can see that as an incentive. I mean, obviously, that's what we're trying to do, is to provide better outcomes for everyone. And I wouldn't have an issue with, with that measuring metric in terms of closing some of the gaps. But I would have an issue with just overall, increasing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Ted, for what it's worth, I'm not advocating an outcomes-based formula, but it's interesting that in higher education in Tennessee, the university's funding is outcome-based. It has to do with levels and improvement that you make over time. It's kind of a complicated formula, but universities have outcomes that affect their funding, like graduation rates, retention rates, things like that. So I just mentioned that because outcomes-based funding formulas aren't unheard of in Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. Good. Any other feedback? I think some of that's probably one, like most things, where the devil's in the details. I think we've all, even just in our current accountability funding model, you can have situations where maybe your gap between your economically disadvantaged and your non, let's say it's 10%, it's 10 percentage points. So you work really hard to try to close that gap, and it turns out everybody goes up. So your non-economically disadvantaged went up, your economically disadvantaged went up, but the gap stayed the same, or maybe the gap even got a little wider. And if you don't lay that out correctly, you can actually almost disincentivize that approach as well, because people start playing with the numbers in there. But I think that's noted. There does seem to be some support for that idea in general, at least having the conversation about it. And so that's what we were trying to determine. So thank you for that feedback.
A question that I have, Ted, and I'm not sure that the answer is known. When looking at this triangle very specifically, are we saying that all four of these elements will be a part of student-based funding, or are a part of the formula? Or are we saying this is for your information and elements that could be involved in student-based formula?
That's a great question. I believe the answer is it's elements that could be involved. I'm pretty sure from the conversations and the kind of the direction the TDOE is steering, that the bottom two are almost non-negotiable. That the first, you have to come up with a base for it to be a student-based funding formula, and then the question of the ratios or the multipliers on top of that. And it would also make sense that, for some of those single shot programs, I think maybe just the tip is negotiable, or things you could do or not do. But it seems, based on the descriptions that I've heard and kind of where they seem to be steering us, those bottom three would all be factors. And again, I think part of what we would need to do from the perspective, we're obviously can talk about it holistically, but from the perspective of suburban and fast growing communities, what are the things that maybe nobody else is going to think of that maybe do need to be multipliers for us? I mean, does it cost more to educate students in a fast growing community, or the facilities needs, for example? We know they are the facilities needs need to be focused on in fast growing communities? And is there a multiplier for that? If there's a certain percentage of growth, for example, that you get, that would probably fall more into that category of the direct funding, perhaps, unless you just put a multiplier on every single kid in a fast growing community, which you could do. All right, this was in, and just so everybody knows, this PowerPoint that we're going over now, this was attached to your meeting invite. The consensus is that it was kind of mislabeled, that it or maybe not labeled as clearly as it could have been, because if you just looked at the first line, it said board chairs, and if I wasn't a board chair, I don't think I'd have read it. And you maybe haven't read it for that same reason, but there is a lot of good context there. And that's why we're going over it. So there's some great links here. You can do a 50-state comparison of other states and see what their funding models look like. There's the Southern Regional Education Board has some really good information there, as does the Council of Chief State School Officers. All right, now we're going to flip back over to the original agenda. See if we can kind of bring this thing on home.
Can you see that?
Yep, I got you.
Okay.
All right, so we've kind of been doing this in real time, but after reviewing those slides, are there any questions about the process that you haven't asked yet? And then are there any additional materials or resources? My advice would be click on those 3 links that were in that PowerPoint and just kind of scroll through those. And I think pretty quickly you'll get a good sense. I read one of the state-by-state ones, and it was very, very helpful in terms of my understanding of what we were even talking about, because I didn't really know at first.
Ted, I have a question on the base.
Yeah.
Real quickly. I know that's the state contribution and the local, and I think we've all gone back and forth with, is fiscal capacity still going to be part of that equation?
Yes, I think that's a critical question, and my understanding is it's an unanswered question at this point.
Ted, you might want a fiscal capacity for some on the group. They might not understand that quite like us directors do.
You want to take a crack at it, Mr. Atkin?
Well, I can give I knew when I said that you were going to make me answer it. So fiscal capacity typically is based on the county's ability to pay. And there are 2 models, TASER and SEBR. And the model that we are currently under, that I'm not allowed to name, uses, depending on where you live and where your school district resides, some combination of one of those 2 formulas, and a percentage basis. If you went all one way, it's going to benefit some districts. If you went all the other model, it's going to benefit other districts. So I think Bill's exactly right. This piece of the student-based formula, where that fiscal capacity comes into play, is going to have to be an important question to get answered.
Thank you. That was excellent, excellent explanation there. And I will say that the commissioner has said that she said that it's very clear and almost a non-negotiable that no one is harmed by the new funding formula, that there shouldn't be a formula that causes a school district to get less than they get now. So I think that's critical. And I think she's also emphasized that one of the reasons that this is so timely, and that legislators may be able to confirm this feeling, is that there are funds available for these types of programs based on the management of Tennessee's finances, I think, over the last several years, so that it is good opportunity to have this conversation at this time. But yes, I agree with Bill and John. Absolutely. That's something that's going to have to be determined, because we've all seen different scenarios run for different fiscal capacity models. And traditionally, when those are run, there are what we call winners and losers, folks that do better than others under the various models. Okay, so and then I think the last one was about, is there anything else that you need in terms of resources? But I think if we all start with, wait a minute. I think if we all start with those links, then we'll be better off at the next meeting just then. So, all right, the meeting discussion guiding questions. Let's see. Is that where we are, next meeting discussion?
Yes.
Okay. All right, at the next meeting, we're going to get the first batch of content for review. I think everybody's aware that the department has done a pretty rigorous schedule of public town halls. They have a public email where folks can email questions. They are certainly inviting us, if you are interested or able, to have your own feedback sessions with your own more hyper-local community. I went to the one that was in Memphis at the National Civil Rights Museum, and have watched a couple of the others just to get some idea of what folks are talking about. But it is a pretty rigorous system of soliciting public feedback. So if anyone would like to do that independently, certainly feel free. If you want to come back to this committee and say, I talked to my faculty, or I talked to my principals, or I talked to my community or my school board, or whoever the case may be, certainly want to encourage everybody to do that and know that that is part of this process. But we're going to get the first batch of content for review at the next meeting. It says typically 1 week in advance, and I know we have another meeting in a week. Penny, is that something we're expecting to get?
Yes,
Yeah.
actually, I've got a call after this one, and we're getting our materials and our links. And I will say this for Senator Rose and Representative Baum, the email that was sent to you all originally bounced back because it was too large. The file was too large. So you don't have those resources. We put those in a Google Doc now, and we're going to share the link with you. You'll be able to access the all of you will be able to access recordings. These recordings on the TDOE website. If you just Google subcommittees, you'll be able to find those recordings as well. But you will be receiving those all of the link to the Google Doc that has all of the materials week by week in it. So that's coming later today.
Well, and Penny, I want to apologize to you, despite asking you about 14 times during this call to help us out. I did not let you introduce yourself. Will you please introduce yourself so everybody knows who you are?
Yes, happy to do that. I'm Penny Thurmond. I am the West Grand Division Corps Director, which means I'm the liaison for the Northwest and the Southwest superintendents. And for most of you all, or a lot of you all, are directors, former directors of schools. But to get an idea of the region, all the districts that I cover is from the Mississippi River to the Tennessee River. And that's, there's 3 of us. There's a West Grand Division, Middle, and then East. And we support all of you. And so that's my job. I am the liaison for all of the superintendents.
And Penny does a great job and deserves to be treated better than she was treated by the committee chair. So, but thank you.
Not a problem. Happy to be here.
All right. Okay, so we're going to get that information as Penny laid out, and what they're saying is that what we're going to need to do in the next meeting is categorize that feedback and resource ideas into categories of must have, should have, nice to have, or other, and we'll have some conversations based on that at the next meeting. And then the guiding question is, over the next 2 weeks, how does and I've got to figure out how to, there's a little bar here that blocks the bottom of what I'm saying. How does the subcommittee want to solicit, or what does that say?
Collect feedback.
Or collect oh, there it is on mine, to answer these questions. So that's something to think about. If you'd like to get some additional feedback from your community or any other way of doing that. And then the next meeting, as we said, will be same time, same station next Friday at noon. We'll be online. We'll discuss the feedback that will be presented to us and categorize that into priorities. All right. Well, it is straight up 1 o'clock. So we may have nailed this, but we'll see. I know the goal is to kind of leave these at an hour, and everybody's time is valuable, certainly. But we also don't want to leave any questions unanswered, or if there's any ambiguity about what we're doing or why we're doing it. At this point, I'll kind of just open it up. Are there any, I guess what I'll call closing thoughts or questions that this group would like before we head into the next week?
Ted, I thank you for being the chair of this, and look forward to working with everyone on here.
Thank you. Likewise.
Marvelous job, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thank you. All right. Does everybody feel like we have a better sense of kind of where we're headed with this?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I hope you all have a fabulous weekend, and I appreciate everybody's engagement and participation. In the absence of any other comments, kind of final call, anybody? All right, I'm going to declare this this first meeting adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Good to see you all.
Bye-bye.